The topic of today's lecture is multilingualism. Monolingualism has some of the most persistent myths associated with it, and one of these is the myth of the monolingual nation state. We're going to begin by looking into it closer and determining whether it really corresponds to reality. It seems to be a matter of common sense for most people that each nation state has its own language. That is to say, a language that belongs to it. Germany has German as its language, France, French, Japan, Japanese, Poland, Polish, and so on. And of course, everybody in a particular nation speaks that language that is natural to it. That just seems rational, doesn't it? After all, speaking the language defines the essence of what it means to be a member, a citizen of this nation, right? How can one consider themselves French if they don't speak French? Can you really be Japanese if you don't speak Japanese? And are you really Mexican if you don't speak Spanish? Well, maybe matters are not as simple as they appear to be at first glance. If we look at the facts of language use in human societies, we'll see that the reality is quite different from what we often assume to be a common sense state of affairs. First of all, while there is no definitive statistical data on the percentage of multilinguals on the planet, we do know that there are 195 recognized nation states in the world, but there are at least 7,000 identifiable languages. It goes to reason then that there would be more than one language spoken in any given nation, especially considering that some languages, such as English, Spanish, Arabic, or French, are spoken as native languages by individuals in multiple countries. Different sources, from the Linguistic Society of America to UNESCO to Ethnologue, an encyclopedic reference catalog of the world's existing 7,111 living languages, estimate that approximately 56 of the world's population is at least bilingual and often multilingual, that is, speaking more than two languages, to various degrees. Individuals often become multilingual because of the complex and multifaceted sociolinguistic situations they're immersed in their daily lives. Let us look at the example of Cameroon, a nation of approximately 20 million people on the western coast of Central Africa. Cameroon is highly multi-ethnic, with multiple cultural and linguistic groups sharing the same geographic area. These groups speak over 250 indigenous languages. But the fact that these groups ended up being part of the nation of Cameroon, as opposed to, say, the neighboring Gabon or Chad or Nigeria, is largely a product of colonial policies and post-colonial division of the African continent into nations by their colonizers, without any regard to historical, ethnic, and cultural identifications and affiliations. About 14% of the population of Cameroon is the Fulani ethnic group, who also live in Chad, Nigeria, Senegal, and Niger. These people speak a variety of dialects of the language that is collectively referred to as Fulfulde. While their relative numbers are smaller than some other ethnic groups in Cameroon, in the early 18th century, Fulani became a culturally and religiously dominant group in a large portion of West Africa, leading to Fulfulde becoming a lingua franca through much of the region, especially in the north and far north provinces of what today is Cameroon. Other common lingua francas in Cameroon are Hausa, Ewondo, Bazaar, Douala, and several others. About 20% of the population of Cameroon are Muslim, and in the areas where Islam is prevalent, or in areas with historically high numbers of nomadic Arabic cattle herders, especially in the vicinity of Lake Chad, the local variety of the Arabic language is used in daily lives, religious education, the market, and the media. Finally, the official languages of Cameroon are English and French, the languages of the former colonizers. Schooling in Cameroon is delivered in one of these languages, so a well-educated person will usually speak either one or the other, and sometimes, albeit not very frequently, both. Bilingualism in Cameroon is only officially recognized when it comes to the use of English and French. Indigenous languages are not frequently taught or formally recognized in government use. Yet they continue to be used by the vast majority of the population in a variety of communicative spheres. So it is quite possible for a Cameroonian person to speak their indigenous native language at two, Fulfulde as a lingua franca, Hausa or Douala also as a lingua franca, Arabic as the language of religious education, and English or French as the language of formal civil education and government work. Thus, the complex history of migration, colonization, and post colonial development has led to quite large numbers of people being multilingual, or at least bilingual in practice. But even monolingual individuals often live in societies that are multilingual on the whole. Let's take, for example, the US. Approximately 80% of the US population age 5 and older speak only English at home, and as a result, consider themselves monolingual in this language. At the same time, the US Census Bureau reports 381 languages spoken in the US. So, who speaks those languages? Where do they come from? Well, one of the largest sources of societal multilingualism is the use of indigenous languages in the territory colonized and culturally dominated by another group. The US is a typical example. Although the majority of its indigenous languages have become extinct, a few are still spoken, with several thousand of native speakers using them. Another source of societal multilingualism is the use of formerly colonial languages as official or predominant in the areas that are no longer colonized. Cameroon, whose complex linguistic situation we discussed just a minute ago, is an example of this phenomenon. English and French are not indigenous to this country, but they are used frequently and widely. Large-scale migration also often leads to societal multilingualism. Histories of several areas in the US can illustrate this quite well. Let's take German migration to the US in the second half of the 19th century. German migrants began to arrive on the North American continent in the late 17th century, settling mostly in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New York. The largest wave of migration from Germany, however, took place between 1820 and 1870. Nearly 8 million Germans settled in the US in that time. Along with other aspects of their culture, these migrants brought with them their language. Although after 2 generations, most became proficient in English, German language persisted. It is only World War I that brought about the change in the attitudes, when German-English bilingualism started to be seen negatively, and the education of children through the medium of German stopped. Finally, societal multilingualism frequently, although not always, leads to the birth of new languages, sometimes referred to as pidgins, creoles, or creoloids. These languages emerge, develop, and coexist alongside their contributing dialects. Such languages as Creole of Sierra Leone, Haitian Creole, or Afrikaans in South Africa began as hybrid dialects. Gradually, they developed into complex systems with stable grammars and lexicons, and are used today as official languages of their nations. Societal multilingualism is rarely symmetrical. In other words, in any given multilingual society, some languages are prevalent and dominant, and others possess a subordinate status. The main reason for this is the power differential between different linguistic groups. Groups with less political power tend to adopt the language of more powerful groups, even when they do not abandon their heritage tongue. They do so in order to gain access to both material and non-material societal resources. Observe, for example, that we live in one of the most linguistically diverse areas of the US, Southern California. According to the US Census Bureau, over 200 languages are spoken by Californians, including 23 indigenous languages. Nearly 43% of the households in the area speak a language other than English at home. Yet English is clearly a predominant language. The vast majority of Californians are English speakers, despite the fact that it is frequently not the first language they acquire at home. Yet relatively few Californians whose native language is English gain proficiency in any other language. Even with the other most common language of California, Spanish, it is much more common for individuals to be Spanish-English bilinguals if their heritage language is Spanish, not English. Moreover, even those who speak a heritage language other than English are often English dominant. In other words, they have stronger oral and literacy skills in English at advanced levels than in their heritage language. A very similar situation existed in the Soviet Union, where Russian was the dominant language, and even in historically non-Russian speaking areas, the local languages were both subordinate and less frequently spoken than Russian. Education was often not available in local languages, and when it was considered less prestigious than education through the medium of Russian. The situation is not much different in Mexico, which legally recognizes 63 national indigenous languages, but where the vast majority of speakers are monolingual in Spanish. The most extreme type of asymmetrical bilingualism is diglossia. Diglossia is a sociolinguistic situation where two distinct dialects or languages are used in different social situations in the same society. One of the languages is usually considered to be more prestigious, a so-called high dialect. The other language or languages are less prestigious and are considered to be low. Despite their low status, they are frequently spoken by all members of a particular community in informal situations. Some examples of diglossia can be found even in our own environment. For example, a college professor who is a native speaker of African American English can be using this dialect at home or with colleagues over lunch, but will deliver lectures or conduct office hours in standard American English. And two engineers in Switzerland might talk to each other in Low German, even while working on a solution to a particular problem, but will then write a memo to colleagues in another institution in High German. And it is not unusual for South Africans to talk English or Afrikaans during business meetings, and then switch to Xhosa during a coffee break. While in diglossic situations, all members of a particular community speak both or all dialects, socially it is considered inappropriate and even unacceptable to use the low dialect in formal situations and the high dialect in informal ones. To sum up, multilingualism is a lot more of a societal norm than we tend to believe. There are two types of multilingualism, roughly speaking, individual and societal. Individual multilingualism refers to the fact that individual people often speak more than one language. It can occur even in predominantly monolingual societies. For example, 87% of Australian population is monolingual in English. However, that does not preclude the fact that many Australians learn French or Spanish or German or Japanese or any other language with a high degree of proficiency. Nor does it preclude bilingualism in an indigenous language and English. Societal multilingualism refers to the presence of multiple languages in a particular society, even if many individuals in this society speak only one language. The US, for example, has a record of over 350 languages, but no single individual speaks all 350. Some people speak 2 or 3, some more than that. Yours truly is fully bilingual and proficient in 2, English and Russian, and has an elementary grasp of German, French, and Spanish, enough to read and understand some basic texts. However, the vast majority of Americans speak only one language, English. Theoretically speaking, a multilingual society can be inhabited nearly 100% by monolingual individuals, as long as all of them are monolingual in a language different from others, and there is at least a small number of multilingual speakers who can serve as language brokers between the groups for the society to function as a whole. The latter situation, however, is rarely observed in practice. Societal bilingualism or multilingualism is also rarely symmetrical. Usually, One of the languages is socially and politically dominant, and the rest are subordinate.